tonight is Fred Ho. He's a longtime activist in the Black and Asian social movements, as well as one of the leading composers in the modern era. Tonight he'll be talking on how Black, Asian, Latino, Indigenous, and progressive whites can build a unity for social justice and matriarchal and ecological revolution. Followed by that, we'll have a unique baritone saxophone recital.
I was an undergraduate student organizer from the years of 1975 to 1979 when I attended Harvard University. Those years were a transitional period, the tail end of the fervent revolutionary upsurges that exploded during the 1960s and the beginning of a neoconservative backlash and momentum that will come to fruition as the Reagan years during the 1980s. The Vietnam War had ended in April 1974 with the clear defeat of the United States, the world's mightiest superpower, by a national liberation movement in South Vietnam united with an anti-imperialist, communist-led guerrilla insurgency in North Vietnam, leading to the unification of Vietnam with the ouster of the U.S. South Vietnamese regime. All over the world, anti-colonial struggles had led to the independence of many former colonies once ruled by Western European powers and the United States. In places where independence had not yet been won, such as Namibia, South Africa, Palestine, Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Eritrea, East Timor, and other places, national liberation struggles were being waged. Unlike the earlier anti-colonial struggles, these national liberation struggles were led by socialist or communist revolutionary organizations with a two-pronged goal of winning national independence and sovereignty and conducting the transformation towards a socialist society. Nation-states in the Third World, comprising the peoples and countries of Asia and the Pacific Islands, with the exception of Japan and Australia, Africa, and Central and South America were also undergoing major democratic uprisings, such as the peoples seeking to remove US-backed dictators such as Marcos in the Philippines, Pinochet in Chile, Somoza in Nicaragua, Amin in Uganda, Arap Moi in Kenya, and others. Third world governments were also forming regional blocs to counter US hegemony in economic and geopolitical affairs, including the formation of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and numerous other trade, scientific, cultural exchange networks, and alliances. Many of these efforts followed in the tradition established by the Afro-Asian Unity Summit held in 1955 in Bandung, Indonesia, which formed the non-aligned movement to chart an independent course from the then two superpowers of the United States and the Western Bloc and the then Soviet Union and the so-called Iron Curtain, or Eastern Bloc countries. Representatives from newly independent and ongoing anti-colonial countries and movements, including African-American writer-journalist Richard Wright, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, Nehru of India, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, and others met in an unprecedented gathering to find common ground and build unity. So during the late 1960s and 1970s, people of African, Asian Pacific, and Latino descent in the United States commonly referred to ourselves as third world peoples. We identified with the struggles of our brothers and sisters in our ancestral homelands, recognizing that we have a common enemy in historical colonialism and current-day imperialism. We rejected the term minority because in a global context, we are the majority. Asia and Africa are the world's two largest continents geographically and in population. Asians are 51% of the world's population. We also recognize that in many parts of the United States, we weren't a minority, including large sections of the Black Belt South, the Chicano concentrations in the Southwest, the Hawaiian Islands, and even many inner city cities such as Detroit, Newark, Washington, D.C., sections of the Bay Area, etc. By claiming the identity of being third world peoples, we saw ourselves as part of the main trend in the world, best expressed by Mao Zedong in the mantra, countries want independence, nations want liberation, people want revolution. Today, the in vogue term that has come to replace third world is the term people of color, which is de-radicalized and gives emphasis to color, or the spurious and fallacious concept of race as the foundation for our identity. Race is a product of racism. As Western European colonial powers colonized the world from the 15th to the early 20th centuries, race was developed as a pseudo-scientific justification for their supremacy and domination in a hierarchical taxonomy with the white European at the top and the darker peoples descending to the bottom. Race is a myth, a lie, a fabrication, since human skin color and other physical features exist along a spectrum and have no determination in socio-cultural, political, economic accomplishment. In other words, color is irrelevant to civilization, except as a lie, myth, and fallacy to justify white supremacy and the oppression of most of the world's people. I am proposing we all stop using the term minority and people of color and reclaim the identity of being third world people. We are the world's majority, and we are struggling to end white supremacy and the domination of the world by a minority of its population inhabiting Western Europe and North America. During the late 1960s, third world college students had unprecedented access for the first time in the United States to higher education, riding upon the storms of the sit-ins and struggles of the African American civil rights movement to desegregate schools and to end formal barriers to education. After the assassination of Malcolm X, the civil rights movement, as perhaps best exemplified in the struggles within SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, underwent a split. Two wings emerged, a pro-reformist, pro-integrationist mainstream civil rights movement, and a more militant wing led by then Stokely Carmichael, who would later become known as Kwame Ture, that would unite the black student movement with the emerging Black Power, Black Liberation movement, powerfully proclaiming the principles of the late Malcolm X: self-respect, self-defense, and self-determination. The black student movement would quickly become very militant, overshadowing and eclipsing the milder, gradualist civil rights leadership and organizations, and offering up new, powerful organizers and leadership and organizations, including YOBU, Youth Organization for Black Unity, SOBU, Student Organization for Black Unity, the BSUs, the Black Student Unions, etc. These youthful, energetic forces fought for the establishment of black studies, for hiring and tenure progressive, militant, and radical faculty, for the establishment of black theme houses in dorms and cultural centers, expanded recruitment and admissions, particularly for students from poor and working class backgrounds, worked for the creation of student support services that would help students deal with their alienation, isolation, and difficulties in being so-called minorities in virtually lily-white campuses and living in social situations. The expanded opportunities into higher education also extended to women, poor and working class whites, and other third world groups, including Chicanos and Puerto Ricanos, Asian Pacific Islanders, and indigenous Native Americans. The struggle to attack inequality and injustice has consistently benefited all marginalized and excluded groups, though white racism has oftentimes blinded poor and working class whites from this historical fact. White supremacist intellectuals attack black and third world studies as academically inferior, irrelevant, unnecessary, and biased. The existing departmental disciplines such as history, sociology, political science, and the rest remained exclusionary bastions of Eurocentric ideology and white supremacists in faculty composition and thought. The new third world departments, be they African American or Black studies, Asian American studies, Chicano studies, Native American studies, women's studies, etc., became important forces for building a curriculum of inclusion and correction. Inclusion by including for the first time in Western intellectual and academic discourse and education the experience of people other than great white men. Correction by dispelling lies, stereotypes, myths, biases, and blatant racism that has permeated white intellectual activity for the past 500 years, masquerading as science, knowledge, fact, and truth. Black and third world studies began to fill in the missing pages and contest and correct the inaccuracies and oftentimes outright fabrications and distortions of the academic status quo of white studies. But social change is an ongoing, protracted, and bitter struggle. The second any changes or gains are made, the power structure seeks to undermine and eliminate them. The mid-1970s to the early 1980s was marked by unremitting battles to protect the hard-fought gains, including the defense of affirmative action, defending the jobs of radical faculty, and trying to win tenure for them, saving special programs from being defunded and cut, and dealing with the rise of neoconservatives of color being promoted and touted by the establishment. On campuses, the first thing the administration proceeded to eliminate were the quote-unquote outsiders, the community activists who oftentimes were the first special program administrators and faculty of Third World Studies, since a generation of PhDs and professionals hadn't been trained and certified yet by the higher education institutions. Second to go were the radical faculty, many who were also community activists, by denying them tenure, not renewing their job contracts, or vilifying them as outside-out agitators and troublemakers. Finally, the last to go was the role of students in decision-making in the governance of Third World Studies departments. Community activists, radical faculty, and student control were replaced by administration-selected professional administrators and faculty who conformed to their masters, who underwent a winnowing process of elitist standards such as the requirement for a PhD and emphasis upon academic work to the exclusion of all other activity. A generation of yes men and yes women, acceptable tokens and sycophants who might look like us, but whose thinking aped that of their powerful masters, and who gladly played their role to deflect student aspirations for community relevance and service. The excision of the community coincides with the imposition of elitist qualifications for hiring and promotion that valorizes subservience to the administration and the old white boy traditions and gatekeepers, and not accountability and performance to the Third World communities. A principal demand of the early movements for Third World Studies was for autonomy, that the Third World Studies departments should not be subservient to the college administration, which had its own administration, finances, and determine its own curriculum and policymaking independent of the rest of the campus. In a very few cases did this actually come about. Most of the gains and programs were a result of Third World Coalition efforts. The administration implemented an insidious strategy and tactic of divide and conquer to prevent strong Third World unity building, just as the United States government carried it out globally. The model minority myth became the principal means to sow disunity between Asian Pacific peoples and other Third World groups. A hierarchy of jealousy and rivalry was fomented. Blacks are the most entitled to special programs and benefits because they have been, until recently, the largest minority in the United States and at the forefront of the struggles for equality in U.S. society. Asians and Latinos and Native Americans should wait in line behind the blacks for their crumbs. Asians don't qualify to be minorities because they do too well on standardized tests and other establishment indicators of success, such as median income, etc. Asians are overrepresented in elite colleges, while blacks and Latinos and Native Americans are underrepresented. Asians overall are doing too well to be considered minorities. By being pitted against each other for the crumbs at the master's table, Third World groups found themselves in a zero-sum game, vying to be the favored flavor of the month minority group, ranked in line for the funding trough according to who could be the most accommodationist by doing the bidding of the administration. Certain token leaders were either groomed or selected, invited to the backroom deal-making. And among Asian Pacific Americans, you can always find those tokens who internalize the model minority myth, touting the slogan of pull yourself up by the bootstraps, I made it, why can't you? These wannabe tokens completely disavow the role that mass struggles played to open spaces and create opportunities for historically excluded peoples. They simply credit their own individual tenacity and diligence as the only possible explanation. Furthermore, as tokens, they are paraded around as examples of diversity when in fact none or very little actually exists. They are also Trojan horses, sent into the Third World communities to misdirect, blunt, and keep the lid on any attempts at mass struggle or opposition. Historically, they have been called Uncle Toms, Aunt Jemimas, Uncle Charlies, Auntie Susie Wongs, Uncle Juans, Oreos, bananas, coconuts, apples. But in today's era of backward and low consciousness, they are celebrated as success stories of the American dream, when in reality they are quislings, sellouts, self-aggrandizing opportunists and careerists at worst, and tokens at best. The current attack on the validity of Third World autonomous organizing comes with the ideological and political invalidation of race as a concept and the proposition of race neutralism. Cornell West gives a mild-mannered liberal defense of race as a totalizing concept in his book entitled Race Matters. Race matters because racism remains tenacious and pernicious and pervasive. Since the 1970s, America's premier liberal higher education institution, Harvard University, has been trying to invalidate the saliency of race, usually by pitting it against the concept of class, arguing that economic inequality dominates over racial discrimination as the overarching explanation for social inequality. What is conveniently ignored is a historical analysis. The dramatic rise in the middle classes for third world peoples in the United States was a result of the mass struggles that brought concessions from the U.S. ruling class, including federal government assistance towards minority small businesses, increased access to professional training, and federal government job opportunities. Furthermore, in the particular development of U.S. society from white settler colonialism, races, or more accurate, nations and nationalities, become classes. The white settler colonialists become the ruling class, and through genocide, forced labor, and repopulation of the continent, create oppressed nations and nationalities that are super-exploited classes. White supremacy replaces class consciousness with race loyalty among whites, who politically and socially choose to de-emphasize their European heritage in favor of identifying as white or Yankee Americans, and thereby identify with white settler colonial rulers, rather than and to the rejection of class consciousness as proletarians. The entire history of the United States is about the consolidation and justification of white supremacy and the oppression of entire nations and nationalities, a forced inequality and dehumanization of all peoples who can't or won't be absorbed into the white settler colonialist matrix. This is the bloody history of America: genocide against Native Americans, the importation of slave and coolie labor, the annexation of the Southwest Territories, the Hawaiian Islands, Puerto Rico, and the transfer of colonial territories formerly possessed by Spain via the Spanish-American War and by France via the Louisiana Purchase, then later the purchase of Alaska from Russia, all part of constructing a system of white supremacist national oppression that uses race as its main signifier and delineator of social class. The pitting of race versus class is another falsification. Race is class in the context of white settler colonial domination. As James Baldwin incisively noted, the price of the ticket of entry into the U.S. mainstream is identification with whiteness, or assimilation is embourgeoisement, the cultural and social identification with Western European traditions and white supremacist historical narratives. Third world peoples are not racial minorities, since I reject race as an explanatory category and simply regard race as a byproduct of racism. We are, more accurately, oppressed nationalities. After all, what race are Puerto Ricans, or Dominicans, or Haitians? These nationalities are an amalgam of all races, but have particular national histories, cultures, and even differing languages. Plantation societies created a forced hybridity that developed into distinctive national movements for independence and sovereignty. Some of these movements gained actual independence, such as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Others were annexed by U.S. imperialism and remained colonies, such as Hawaii and Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Guam, the U.S. Marshall Islands, Alaska. These remaining colonies were victims of either U.S. invasion and annexation or the transfer of spoils from colonial wars. The term oppressed nationalities is scientific. Third world peoples are nationalities who are oppressed by a dominant oppressor nationality, that is white Americans, whose government sits in Washington, D.C. Some white supremacist socialists also argue for the invalidity of the national questions and assert a race neutralism in their view of the American working class. Such a view fails to recognize that white settler colonialism has divided and stratified the U.S. multinational working class. White workers are more privileged than third world workers from better wages, inclusion into organized labor, which has historically been virulently racist and exclusionary towards third world workers, and from white skin privilege, the accumulated, pervasive, and ubiquitous benefits of being white in a white supremacist society. The white chauvinist socialists failed to recognize national inequality and its attendant primacy, privilege, and exclusivity afforded to all members of the oppressor nationality, including its workers. Apartheid South Africa and Zionist settler colonialist Israel have a similar social histories as the United States. A settler colonial proletariat that is racist and protective of its privileges against the hordes of third world workers who must live on Bantustans and refugee camps, carry ID cards to document their inferior status, and work in the worst conditions for the worst wages. The plethora of white-skinned privileges in U.S. society is virtually second nature and unnoticeable to whites, and fearfully accepted and often unchallenged by many oppressed nationalities as simply part of the status quo and daily life. Whites are never viewed as a credit to their race, or the media representations considered suspect as stereotypes. An all-white gathering is rarely questioned as white supremacy. The qualifications of successful and leading whites is never questioned. The fact that whites and white lifestyles are the standard for fashion, beauty, and the good life is unquestioned. Whites aren't subject to racial profiling. Somehow the racial slurs against whites, such as honky, don't seem as charged or harsh as the racial slurs for oppressed nationalities, such as nigger, chink, jap, spit, wetback, beaner, etc. Perhaps because white slurs haven't been associated with lynchings, racist violence, racist mob attacks, genocide, and the destruction of entire communities, etc. And the examples are shamefully and horrifyingly too abundant. The needs of third world students on majority white colleges are numerous and complicated. The Third World Student Organization has always taken the lead in addressing and servicing these needs, which include cultural, social, recreational, academic support, educational, and activist. White students have a plethora of organizations that address single issues or needs, such as the tennis club, the campus newspaper, the theater troupe, the singing choir, the this and that club. Third world students must find their needs and interests addressed primarily in one organization, their Third World Student Organization. That is why third world student organizations cannot be solely and exclusively just political or just social recreational or just cultural. Some of the token third world would-be leaders advocate that the third world student organization must be primarily social, cultural, recreational in order not to appear radical, militant, or make whites feel unwelcome or uneasy. This is misguided for not only divorcing the social cultural from the political, but also for suffocating the aspirations of third world students to change the campus, the curriculum, to make bridges to our respective communities, and to see ourselves as part of the larger constellation of social forces seeking to change society. The struggles of third world students on college campuses has been inseparable from the liberation struggles of our respective peoples. At its strongest, third world student organizing has supported community struggles by bringing in speakers to educate us about these struggles, to support them by fundraising and participating in local and national actions. Third world student organizing has filled the gap that even third world studies departments have, especially in the areas of the arts and cultural events, bringing to campus non-academic speakers and artists. For example, American popular music is quintessentially African American music, and African American music has been a global revolutionary music for the 20th century, especially its vanguard forms embodied in the concept of jazz. While classes on hip-hop are commonly taught within the purview of black studies, regrettably, jazz is primarily taught in the music department. Hip-hop, especially in its current commercialized manifestations, is an oversimplified performance form, while jazz is one of the most sophisticated, complex, and revolutionary musics for the planet. It is not uncommon to find in most jazz classes the students are predominantly white. Unfortunately, black students are denied this knowledge to this great African American revolutionary art form. They regard jazz as old-fashioned and sadly irrelevant, and don't recognize that until recently, jazz was the vanguard black music for every major social development in the black community and in the black liberation movement overall. Students can create artists in residencies for jazz artists or bring in jazz performers to do concerts and talks so that third world students can directly benefit from the knowledge about this revolutionary art form. There continues to be much work that needs to be done, and the Third World Student Organization remains the principal vehicle to take on these challenges. I will now perform a short recital on the baritone saxophone and then take your comments and questions. Thank you. Over a century and a half ago, the Chinese were the first Asian Pacific peoples to come to the United States in large numbers.
The second Asian Pacific peoples to come to the United States in large numbers were the Japanese. third Asian Pacific peoples to come to the United States in large numbers were the Filipinos, or Filipinos, since there's no F sound in the Tagalog of the sign language.
Political question. When I was reading the Ready for Revolution, which is the life and struggles of Stokely Carmichael, what he does is he was reflecting on his relationship with John Lewis. And then in the end he said, you know, kind of in retrospect, that he kind of understands the importance of a united front between those that are working within the system and those that are working from outside of the system together to achieve common goals. You know, what are your thoughts on that thesis? And secondly, in terms of radical third world peoples in electoral politics, is there any hope for us?
I'm a big believer in the United Front, both as tactic and strategy. What does that mean? Strategically, it's the only way in which substantial fundamental change will happen. But you have to be clear that external change operates through affecting the internal. So you need to have both. And it all depends on what you can stomach and tolerate, whether you're going to be on the inside or the outside. I can't stomach being on the inside, plus no one would hire me being on the inside, given the way that I look, my demeanor, and everything about me, you know. So there's no chance for me to be on the inside, okay? So I recognized that a long time ago, so I embraced being on the outside, but you need both, okay? What is more important? Strategically, what is more important is the outside, because you have to create alternatives that foreshadow and serve as a template for something new and different, which is not possible to build on the inside. However, it's possible for the inside to follow examples of that created by the outside, because the outside is not locked into all the winnowing process that goes on for you to be allowed to be in the inside. The United Front is a tactic and a strategy. A tactic because it will always change, and the betrayal of people and their retreat from the United Front, or their abandonment of it, or their selling out of it, will constantly happen, because the establishment will always want to make a deal, and will make a deal with those who are most susceptible to that. You know, whether it be allowing them to come into the electoral process, which they were not part of before, or those who are already inside that process getting huge perks and benefits, you know. So it's a conditional, at the same time, strategic tool. How do I feel about electoral politics? I feel it's necessary and important that everyone should vote, but not have the illusion that can change anything. Why is it important to exercise it? Because of all the struggle that it took to get it, and at the same time, to push the boundaries of whatever concessions you brought about to its maximum. But at the same time, never totally believe that that's the way to go. Something Malcolm X said that stuck with me for a long time: if voting could really change anything, it'd be illegal. And it was at one time. It was at one time for the majority of people, for all women and for oppressed nationalities. Okay? And for sometimes certain European groups, the Irish, the Italian, until they joined they became white, basically. They sold out being Irish and Italian for becoming white, Yankees, in other words. So that's how I feel about elections. You know, took a lot of struggle to get that, so we should use it, but not have any illusions about it.
So you mentioned, my introduction of you mentioned a matriarchal ecological revolution. Can you go on a little bit about that?
Sure. I feel Marxism is the original matriarchy. If you study Marx and Engels carefully and thoroughly, particularly the work Origin of Private Property, the State, you come to understand that the first class to be overthrown were women. Why? Because original human society, before the advent of classes, which from different parts of the world occurred at different times, but let's say prior to about 8,000 BCE, was primarily a matriarchal society, matrilineal, matrifocal, however you want to use those terms, in which women held substantial power, probably majority of power. Okay? Today, if you believe that socialism is basically the realization of the last shall be first, the first last, and I use that quote even though I'm not a Christian, but if that's your vision of socialism, then if women bear 100% of the world's children, grow 70% of the world's food, do 60% of the world's work, albeit unpaid or underpaid, but only earn 10% of the world's income and own less than 1% of the world's property, the reversal of that patriarchy would be matriarchy. It's a hard concept to grasp because some people excuse me, well, are you saying women should be the new ruling class and therefore they should oppress and rule over men? No, I'm saying that the fruits of labor should justly go to the producers. That's my materialist analysis. So that would be so simply social justice. Now, three things are happening in the world. It's genocide against nationalities. There's ecocide against the environment, ecology, Mother Earth. And there's matricide against women, whether it be, clitorectomies to killing of baby girls, to the super exploitive conditions of high-tech factories in the Pacific Rim, in which women, factory workers working with microchips go blind at age 17, and at 25, kids on the street ridicule them when they're blind and say, "Granny, where are your glasses?" Those three things, three monstrous evils, to quote Rachel Carson, are the result of class society, and the class society that we're at currently is global stage, is monopoly capitalism. Okay, so to eliminate those three monstrous evils requires a fundamental revolution in which a new social order comes about, in which the people who produce all the things we need, use, consume, become the controllers. At the same time, we have to do a significant amount of redistribution of everything. Someone, an environmentalist, said to Fidel Castro, what would happen, what do you think about countries like India, China, Indonesia with large populations having the same standard of living as the United States, all of them having per capita the same amount of automobiles? Castro answered, the logic of capitalism requires and demands it, but it's impossible for the earth to sustain it. The United States is 5 to 6% of the world's population, but consumes 50% of the world's resources. The world can't sustain that. So that means that the accumulation waste of a first world affluent standard of living, and it's unequal in that because you and I don't consume as much as a CEO of a Fortune 500 corporation in terms of their lifestyle, but also that class of people and those companies consume and waste tremendously more than you and I individually or our families. But nonetheless, the earth cannot sustain the amount of automobiles that we have per capita in the United States if the rest of the world is to have it. So I don't subscribe to this productivist, Promethean technological utopia. That's why I'm a Luddite. I'm not against technology. I'm for low-impact technology, technology that is not hurtful to the commonality between this people and the planet. So I don't believe in unbridled technology is an inherently good thing. In fact, I think that most technology as we understand it today develops in the context of capitalism and therefore cannot be extricated from the way it was birthed and developed, and needs to be reworked and reformulated and redone or discarded. So that's kind of my vision of revolutionary socialism. That is a matriarchal socialism. That matriarchy is basically the just and natural way of the planet.
I wanted to know more about what you think are the steps to get from here to there.
What you want for tomorrow, you have to embody, personify, and exemplify now. So, if you don't want to live in a future continuing white supremacist society, your organizations should never be majority white. If you don't want to live in a patriarchal society, your organization should never be majority men in leadership. Okay, now that can't be just tokenism. What that has to do is a fundamental alteration of culture and basically identity. Most whites cannot accept leadership from third world people. And I've been in a number of socialist organizations. I refuse to join one that does not personify the values of the society I want to be in, okay? And the root of it is the incorrect line on the national question, the elevation of the concept of race to the elimination of the concept of national oppression, oppressed nations and nationalities. Because what's the difference between race and the national question? It's a question of land and territory. Land and territory. The land that the United States took and still occupies has to be redistributed. And until socialists can understand the dismembering of the 50 United States is part and parcel of a program that has to embrace national liberation struggle, it will never have the revolutionaries and the most advanced leadership of those national struggles support it. Okay? So that's kind of, in a very general way, what I'm talking about. So I believe ideology, political line, or program has to embody, the vision that you really want to have in the United States. Do you believe that we should have closed borders and that this nation state or any nation state has the right to basically control its own borders? You basically are ahistorical because those borders changed constantly from the 13 original colonies to what it is now with a state that's 3,000 miles in the Pacific Ocean, another one that's 2,000 miles north, separated by another large country, and these colonial territories, scattered in the Pacific Islands. It's illogical. It has nothing to do with any natural development of anything. It just has to do with the redistribution of colonial spoils, annexation, genocide, and repopulation. So a socialist program that says the 50 United States, the borders cannot be changed is one that I can't get behind. So, the program, the so-called political line, has to meet with what you really think that future society should be about and embrace. Part of decolonization, besides changing the way you look, the way you think, is changing your names, because oftentimes your name's given to you, not something you created. So during the height of the Black liberation struggle in the late 60s through the 70s, there was discussion about what to call people of African descent in the Americas. For a long time, the word Negro was prevalent, but then that was discarded, just like Asians discarded Oriental, or Hispanics discarded Hispanics for Latino, even though that term still is problematic since it refers primarily to the Roman Catholic traditions. I wrote a poem called Chickens Coming Home to Roost, Violence and Death the American Way, as part of the Jericho movement, which is a movement started by U.S. political prisoners for their freedom and their amnesty. I'm going to combine this poem with Free New Africa Boogaloo. Free New Africa Boogaloo is a piece about the transition from the civil rights movement to the Black Power movement. The civil rights movement asserted that the proper response to unjust laws is to break them. The Black liberation movement asserted that the oppression of people of African descent in the Americas was a product of U.S. colonization and imperialism, and that was the common enemy. Original lies. Invaders and conquerors have a curious logic. They make themselves to be the native sons and daughters, the founding fathers, the discoverers, while the indigenous people are misnamed Indians, treated as animals and slaughtered, forced off their lands, forced to speak their conqueror's language, English, which now becomes the native tongue, forced to worship their conqueror's God, forced to give up their culture, their dress, their hair, their names, their identity, and then made into noble savages and modern-day brand labels for malt liquors, Jeeps, and sport team mascots. Yes, invaders and conquerors have a curious logic, an illogical logic, a logic that is ill, sick, perverted, and twisted. A lie told often enough will come to replace the truth as long as the liar is holding all of the guns and is the official storyteller. Now prepare for the new Holocaust, when doubting the Holocaust as PC, when slavery is made out to be not all that bad, when the natives are made out to be crueler than their conquerors. These are the lies my public school told me, the lies my public television station, PBS, the Petroleum Broadcasting System, told me. The lies my elected officials told me, voted into an office by an electorate of whom the majority doesn't even bother to vote. The lies that Mumia Abu-Jamal, as voice of the voiceless, wrote, worked to expose and to correct, which National Public Radio censored, reneging on its agreement to air Mumia's live from death row commentaries. All things considered, all things considered, all things considered, not if the Fraternal Order of Police objects. But consider this irony of colonialism. The European settlers who came as pilgrims were ex-prisoners, religious rebels, and small farmers, persecuted in England and other European countries. Consider the poor trash of the continent, prostitutes, thieves, dissidents, and heretics, just like John Africa and the Move family who settled a small section of a West Philly neighborhood as an alternative religious community. The white settlers took up armed struggle against England to win their independence and to become the United States government, who then proceeded to murder, steal from, persecute, oppress, criminalize, sentence, imprison, and execute the poor, the dissident, the different. But I know the original affirmative action was white supremacy. The original illegal immigrant was Christopher Columbus. The original welfare began with patriarchy. The U.S. government tells us there are no political prisoners here, even though human rights groups cite over 150 such prisoners, including Mumia Abu-Jamal, Leonard Peltier, Sekou Odinga, Marilyn Buck, Carlos Alberto Torres, Mutulu Shakur, Sundiata Kole, and many others, and even one who escaped to Cuba, the legendary woman warrior, revolutionary mother of the Black Liberation Army, Assata Shakur. How can there be political prisoners in the U.S., according to the logic of the occupiers, when it doesn't recognize it as illegal the genocide it committed against the Native Americans, the enslavement of Africans, the colonization of Puerto Rico and Hawaii, then those who are fighting for the liberation are nothing more than criminals who should be locked up or executed. In these original lies lies the hidden truth that political power does indeed grow from the barrel of a gun, and America has proven that. To claim anything else would be perjury.